Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to let folks come on in and join us, so we'll just give that a minute. Thanks for being here. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started and just welcome folks in as they join us. Hi, everyone. My name is Adrienne. I am the coordinator for the California Criminal Justice Funders Group. Thank you all so much for being with us today. It's our last webinar of 2020, which for all of the reasons you all know feels like a big deal that we have made it here. And I'm really excited and pumped about today's conversation. We're going to be together until about 3:15. Our official webinar title is We're Just Getting Started, 2020 Post-Election Debrief. I think that feels true for what I know about the folks who you're going to hear from. And I also, in retrospect, wanted it to say we're just getting started and we're so excited to take a break and rest too, because these folks have been working so hard. And what we're going to do today is hear a little bit about all of the work that has gone into the wins that we saw in November. Oftentimes we only see what breaches the surface, the tip of the iceberg, and we know that communities impacted by criminalization, policing, and prisons have been working nonstop on these fights for decades. So I'm so excited to learn more about that behind the scenes, long-term grassroots organizing work that made those victories possible this November. We will be moderated by Roger Perez from the Roy and Patricia Disney Family Foundation, who is also a member of our steering committee. So excited about that too. Thank you, Roger. And I will be sharing a survey, as always, with you all to follow up afterwards. Let us know your thoughts, and we'll be sharing soon our sort of sharpened focus for 2021, and always seeking your collaboration and feedback on the direction of our group. I think that's it. We unfortunately won't be joined by Gina, Clayton, Johnson today, but we'll be sharing a little bit about Essie Justice Group's statement on Proposition 25 in the chat when we get to that part of the conversation. So with that, I'll pass it on over to Roger. Thanks again, everyone.
Cool, thanks, Adrienne, and thank you all to the panelists who are here. I think this is a pretty exciting moment. And you said end of the year, and I can't believe, Adrienne, it's already the 14th, and it went fast, it went slow, it was a roller coaster the whole way, and I'm glad to end it on a good note, like end it on this note that we're having today, because it's pretty exciting. And just getting started, we're excited to see what happens in 2021. My name is Roger Perez. I'm a program officer with the Roy and Patricia Disney Family Foundation. And at RPDFF, we focus on affordable housing preservation, environmental justice, and criminal justice reform in LA, Tacoma, and New Orleans. And for all of our program areas, we focus on supporting BIPOC-led organizations who ensure that community voice is at the center of community development. And this looks a lot like supporting orgs involved in base building, power building, and connecting local efforts to policy advocacy and systems change, which again, it makes me super excited for today's conversation. And we're lucky to have in the room, in our virtual room here, some amazing people who are at the forefront of reform, abolition, and efforts on the local, so LA, county, statewide, and of course, this will have implications on the national level. I think this is a great opportunity to learn, great opportunity to ask questions. We're really encouraging everybody to drop questions in the chat as we're going along. And it's also really important because we're coming off the heels of an election that's still sending ripples throughout the field. An election where in Los Angeles, voters voted in District Attorney GeorgeGascónand, who committed to banning certain enhancements, ending cash bail, potential resentencing, among a couple of other things, a host of other things. Also, where LA voters approved Measure J, super exciting, which will set aside at least 10%, which is the floor, but I'll let Eunisses, who termed that, tell us a little bit more, for funding for alternatives to incarceration and community investment, and that also that these funds do not go towards law enforcement, jails, or prisons. And also where the state as a whole proved that they're on the right track by approving Prop 17, and I'll let Taina talk to us a little bit more about the numbers, in denying Prop 20 in 2025. And I'm sure you're all aware that the wins didn't happen overnight. They're not the product of one individual, but they're examples of successes that successes that have been in the works for years and driven by those most involved and most impacted, and led by the people you see in the room today, by the amazing panelists. You know their faces, you know their names. We have Taina Vargas, co-founder and executive director of Initiate Justice, Eunisses Hernandez, the co-executive director of La Defensa, and Brian Kaneda, Los Angeles coordinator for Californians United for Responsible Budget, or CURB. So I'm going to stop talking. I'll turn it over to the ones that we want to hear about and what you all are up to. And then we're going to actually break out into a couple of moderated questions for each of the speakers. But again, as we're going along, please drop your questions in the chat and we'll loop back around. Taina, before I switch to those moderated questions, it'd be nice just to hear quick snapshot of who you are, what you're up to, and where you're located.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, Roger, and thanks for having me on today. Super excited to be part of this esteemed group of panelists. My name is Taina Vargas. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the co-founder and executive director of Initiate Justice. What we work to do is to end mass incarceration by activating the political power of people in prison, formerly incarcerated people, and people with incarcerated loved ones. We currently have about 35,000 currently incarcerated members. So about 1 in 3 people in California State Prison is a member of Initiate Justice. We have about 150 inside organizers, folks inside who are being trained up in organizing and advocacy work, and have graduated 5 cohorts of our Institute of Impacted Leaders, which are for advocacy and organizing training for formerly incarcerated people and people with incarcerated loved ones. So what we aim to do is to pass laws to bring people home from prison and continue to grow this power by investing in the leadership development of folks who are the experts of our own experiences. I am based here in Los Angeles, but Initiate Justice is a statewide organization. And I will pass it to Brian.
Thank you so much, Taina. I too am so flattered to be in this wonderful group of people. My name is Brian Kaneda, and I'm the LA coordinator for CURB, Californians United for a Responsible Budget. Our mission is to reduce the number of people in prisons and jails, reduce the number of prisons and jails in the state, and shift wasteful spending away from incarceration and toward the things that actually keep us safe, like housing, healthcare, good jobs, and education. We believe in care, not cages. I'm the LA coordinator of CURB, so I live in Los Angeles. I'll be transitioning into a role as deputy director of our statewide organization at the end of this year. And I will pass it to the wonderful, brilliant Eunisses.
Thank you, Brian. Congratulations. And thank you, everyone, for letting me join this conversation today. My name is Eunisses Hernandez. I am the co-founder and co-executive director of La Defensa, a C4 that was founded to begin to develop the work around judicial accountability, holding judges accountable, establishing and developing alternatives to incarceration here in LA County so that we can decarcerate LA County, so that we can close jails down, and also working on pretrial reform. And we were just founded, we just had our 1-year birthday, and we mostly focus here in LA. Thank you. And I'll pass it to Roger to continue the conversation. I'm just really excited to be with you all today.
Awesome, 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 and happy birthday, happy promotion, happy everything. It's a good year in 2020. So Taina, if it's okay with you, Prop 17, you are the one there, and all your members, and let's start off by talking about something that you've been deeply involved in with quite some time, and Prop 17 opened the possibility for those on parole to vote. And while I was brushing up, checking out Ballotpedia, I came across your name, of course, and I think it sums it up really nicely. Your quote there of it being, the removal of the right to vote is not based in an interest in public safety. Rather, it's rooted in a punitive justice belief system that intentionally attempts to rob marginalized people of their political power. So I, was and still am super excited to see Prop 17 pass, and really interested in your perspective. Tell us a little bit about the process. First, why is it important? Where did it come from, this idea, and what did it take to get from square one to where we are today?
Absolutely, thanks, Roger. So as I had mentioned, Initiate Justice was created so that folks who are impacted by incarceration could be leaders in this political organizing work that we do. A little bit about myself, I've worked as a statewide legislative advocate for the past 6-7 years, and I had an incarcerated loved one, and my two worlds were very different. Monday through Friday, being involved in all of these legislative briefings, and then Saturday and Sunday in a prison visiting room, surrounded by the people who are impacted by these policies. Yet there was a serious disconnect between who really was able to have their voices heard at the table. So when we first started Initiate Justice, we received a call from one of our incarcerated members who's now on our board of directors. His name is Raslan Thomas. And he said, if Initiate Justice really wants us to have our voices heard, we need to be able to have the right to vote. So that was in early 2017, and we launched a signature collection campaign to try and qualify an initiative that would have restored voting rights to not only formerly incarcerated people, but currently incarcerated people as well, to end all felony disenfranchisement in the state. We didn't get the amount of signatures that we needed. However, we did get the attention of the legislature. So shortly after that, Assembly Member McCarty reached out to us and said, let's get this on the ballot through a legislative referral. And that became ACA 6, which required a 2/3 majority to clear the legislature in both houses. But ultimately what ACA 6 did was place Prop 17 on the ballot, which restored the right to vote to all people on parole in California. So what that means now is that as of the day after the election, all people, once they are released from state custody, automatically have their right to vote restored. So California is now the 19th state in the country where there are no restrictions on voting once you are released from state prison. And the reason that it's so important for building power is, several reasons, right? If the right to vote wasn't important, then there wouldn't have been so many historic attempts made by wealthy white men in history to prevent different marginalized groups from having our voices heard. I think even watching this most recent election where we saw, incoming President Joe Biden win by such small margins in different counties, we can see how important it is that people who are closest to the problem are showing up and having their voices heard at the polls. But there's many other reasons as well. When you have your right to vote restored, you can also run for office. So this means that, people who are on parole can now run for elected office in California. You also need to be a registered voter to be able to sign petitions to qualify initiatives for the ballot. So folks, we have now more than 50,000 folks who will be able to do that. And when we're thinking about the future, what other things, this panel is called We're Just Getting Started. When we start to think about what we want to pass in the future, like repealing the 3 strikes law, and things like that, now everybody who is formerly incarcerated in the state will be able to sign their name on a petition and say, this is something that I would like the opportunity to vote on. I firmly believe that the only reason that any system of oppression can exist is because it makes the folks impacted by it feel that we're powerless. Specifically the mass incarceration system, folks inside and their loved ones are really in a place of fear, where our lives are literally on the line. So the passage of Prop 17 was historic, and it was just really one of the many pillars that need to fall for us to be able to bring this system down. And another thing I'll say about the campaign is that it truly was a grassroots-led campaign. It was led by formerly incarcerated people like me who have incarcerated loved ones. We didn't raise a lot of money. We got enough to get it done, but we did it with a relatively small budget. But then we ended up passing with more yes votes than any other proposition on the California state ballot. And I firmly believe that we were able to have such a decisive victory because we've been laying the foundation, because we've been mobilizing the folks who are most directly impacted by these issues. So I'm just really grateful for everyone who has supported not just Initiate Justice, but all the coalition members who were supportive of the Prop 17 campaign, including Curb, who was a co-sponsor of ACA 6. And I think that this just really goes to show that when you invest in people, when you see us as part of the solution, we can have really big, exciting wins. And I can't see what we can do next.
That's amazing. Thank you. And just as one tiny little follow-up question, that timeline. So when was ACA 6 and when was that initial infrastructure laid until, what are we at, 2020, November 3rd? Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, it felt like such a long process. ACA 6 was introduced on January 28, 2019. And constitutional amendments don't need to follow the same legislative calendar as bills. So throughout the whole process, it was agonizing. We had no idea when we were going to be heard in committee. We had no idea when we were going to be brought up for the floor. So we passed the assembly on September 5th, 2019. It took us 9 months to get out of our first house. And then it took, 9 months to get out of the Senate. We passed the Senate June 24th, 2020. And then all of a sudden it was like, boom, now you've got a couple of months for the election, set up a ballot measure committee, start raising money, get it all done, because we couldn't do a lot of those things until we knew we were going to qualify for the ballots. And then we had to do polling and all of the things. So it was definitely a learning opportunity. A lot of the campaign felt like, hurry up and wait. But I'm just so grateful that with the, support of the people, we were able to get it done.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And it's interesting, you get that it takes time, it takes sometimes more than a year, more than 5 years, more than 10 years to lay this infrastructure. And, I really like how you kind of home in on that fact of the time required, the people required, and then sometimes you have this kind of ebb and flow of work. So for me, it's really helpful to kind of picture that of how it lays out. And I'll switch to you, Brian, to kind of pull on this thread a little bit, thinking about your work with Curb. And, last week we connected and our conversations seemed to kind of circle around two themes, or, two things were kind of brought up a lot. One was reading the room. So, how more Californians are on board for more bold and progressive reform, and two, reinvestment. So ensuring that these dollars filter out of these outdated and broken criminal justice system and towards more of community investment. So can you tell me a little bit more about this dynamic and how Prop 20, which would have recategorized some crimes as wobblers and required DNA collection, among other things, how this illustrates that Californians are, where Californians are in this moment?
Yeah, thank you. Those are really good questions. And first, let me congratulate Taina on the success of Prop 17. Initiate Justice is incredible, and there was so much incredible leadership in that space that I was consistently inspired. Well, I think to a certain extent, the audience for ballot measure talking points, which is to say the electorate, has been wising up to some of these moves to further criminalize people. That's why Prop 20 felt especially egregious to me, and why I knew that Curb had to push back hard with our own campaign, even outside of the larger No on 20 coalition's work, which we were part of as well. Prop 20's specific intent was to roll back some of the most significant criminal legal reforms of the past decade, many of which were voted into law by the people of California, such as Prop 47 and 57. Now, those reforms are flawed in their own way insofar as they didn't go far enough, but they have moved us inches closer to justice by making freedom more possible for thousands of people. Prop 20 was so dangerous because it threatened to erase our hard-won progress based on inaccurate data about non-existent increases in violent crime in California. For instance, in 2019, the violent crime rate decreased by 2.4%. This fear is fueled by the money of law enforcement unions, which view Black Lives Matter protesters as terrorists, and grocery stores who want to turn wobbler misdemeanors into felonies and, you know, send people to the electric chair for stealing a cart of food. It's really silly. In 2020, and really for the past few years, this Trumpian tough on crime rhetoric has stopped playing so well in California. People really see it for what it is, which is fear mongering without facts. Not many people in California want to roll back these vital reforms, which would devastate Black and brown communities, marginalize people with felonies and increase recidivism, and pack already overcrowded prisons and jails during a global pandemic, stealing resources from marginalized communities that need it most in this moment of crisis. So all that being said, I can't really think of a worse ballot initiative for the year of Black Lives Matter. The author of this proposition was unsurprisingly a sheriff for 35 years. Prop 20 was decisively rejected by 62% of Californians by a margin of 24 percentage points. So that's, you know, that's pretty significant. In its audacity, Prop 20 completely failed to, as Roger said, read the room. And the people said, nope, people are not here for that right now, thankfully. They don't want DNA samples collected on misdemeanors. That's creepy and intrusive. It's also a big warning sign. These systems of racism and oppression, particularly anti-Black racism, are constantly searching for ways to morph and shift and recalibrate to self-sustain. And that process is insidious. Right now, the way that is happening is with data, right? With intrusive data collection, weaponizing surveillance technology, like through Amazon's new security system, algorithm-based risk assessment tools that were nearly codified statewide as part of SB 10. And that's why the work to defeat Proposition 25 that Justice LA led was so important. Even though I completely understand the desire to end cash bail and share that goal, we don't want to swap out one bad system for another. Anyway, there are a billion things wrong with Prop 20, more than 25 billion to be precise in dollars of extra taxpayer money Prop 20 would have cost by 2025. So the uprisings of the past few months have really transformed our society. And a major way that they've impacted how we think about the world is that people are paying significantly more attention to that money spent and to budgets in general, especially budgets for law enforcement. This year, the state of California will spend about $15 billion with a B, taxpayer dollars on corrections, a number that rises annually, even as prison populations decrease. This doesn't include money spent on local county jails, sheriff's department, district attorneys. Newsom has pledged to close 2 state prisons in 3 years, but the state's own legislative analyst office has provided data on the cost savings of closing 5 prisons and releasing 20,000 people to the tune of about $400 million in savings, rising annually, exponentially. And in the interest of public health and economic sustainability, CURB intends to recommend closing 10 prisons in the next 3 years and reinvesting those dollars back in community. Carceral spending has historically been a black hole from which no dollar can escape. And that's why it's been so powerful for a mass audience to really hear our invest, divest message in a big way for the first time. I was on the steering committee for Measure J, led by Eunisses, who's here with us today. And watching the light bulb click on for LA County residents, connecting everything in real time was so powerful. Budgets finally became sexy, which was, Curb's lifelong goal that we've been working towards since 2003. So for people to be like, oh yeah, this makes sense, is pretty cool and affirming. And this is the result of the community's work, building people power literally for decades, especially in LA County, led by incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people who most certainly are my teachers. And the reason why we are here today is that I think people finally started to actually listen to Black people and to impacted people, and not because folks grew nice overnight, it's because we demanded it. I had a meeting with a really wonderful philanthropic institution that I respect so much and have for such a long time. And they approached us this year and we were so flattered. In our first meeting, they said, please forgive us for being late on this, but we're here now. And I was like, yes, no problem. You're here now. That's perfect. Same thing to all of the lovely new white folks in the streets. I'm ready for it. I'm ready to meet people wherever they're at, but not by compromising our mission to fit into anyone's preconceived boxes. I think that's an essential part of our work, holding that line and planting seeds in people's minds about what's possible. So it's nice to see some of that bloom.
Nice, thank you. And it's planting those seeds, watching them bloom, and as you say, of using some of those data points, using some of the reporting or some of the communications piece to really exemplify of like what divesting looks like, what investing into a system of care actually looks like. And it's super strong. I mean, and it makes a lot of sense. To your point of closing instead of 5, let's go for 10. And what I really appreciated about this conversation last week is the boldness of it. Let's not back down now. Let's continue to push more and harder, because it only makes sense. And again, it's leading up to your question there, Eunisses, is thinking about how we did in LA and how we can continue to push it across the state, and hopefully for a nation or national wide movement, essentially. So I'd like to turn to you, Eunisses, and last but certainly not least, and love to hear what you're thinking as we welcome in Gascon as the new DEA in Los Angeles, and as Angelina has voted to invest more into alternatives to incarceration through Measure J and community investments. So it's similar to the question I asked Taina of where did this idea come from? Where did this initiative come from? And what did it take from start to finish? And I'm kind of homing in around that question because there's still some folks in the room that say that this and these accomplishments are due to 1 or 2 progressive politicians, but it kind of pushes aside all the long and hard work done by community. And love to hear your perspective on that.
Thank you. I wish progressive politicians would take on these policies so that we wouldn't have to. That's the first thing. But Measure J is a LA County ballot measure that moves 10% of locally generated tax dollars into 2 buckets: direct community investment that looks like youth support and program jobs. It looks like building up capital infrastructure of affordable housing and housing support. And then also alternatives to incarceration, which actually looks like community-based pretrial services, the building out of behavioral health services, and actual capital infrastructure building up of the access to these services. It is forever. It changes the county constitution, and there's a couple caveats, such as the traditional system of injustice cannot tap into these dollars whatsoever, and they don't get to be a part of the implementation process either, which is something very intentional, because as Taina and Brian, I'm sure, can talk to, there's been plenty of bills passed at the state level where it's moving dollars into quote unquote reentry services, supportive services, and they get stuck in places like probation or the prosecutor's office, like, as they've gotten millions in Prop 47 savings that we've seen. So with Measure J, we want to be very clear, like, no, you cannot touch any of these dollars. So I just wanted to give a little bit of what Measure J actually is. And what did it take to get here? Like, how did the idea come to be? Well, it builds off over a decade of work in LA County that has been done to stop jail construction. We've been asking for LA County to move dollars away from the Sheriff's Department for, nearly that same amount of time. But it also builds off the work done by Black Lives Matter here in LA, where they have been calling for, asking for the full pie, which is defund the police, and them helping create a political landscape that we're in. It also builds off of, what we've seen, which has felt like weekly videos of people getting murdered by police, state-sanctioned violence. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Andres Guardado, Kenneth Ross Jr., all these folks, their deaths created and the people who marched for their lives create a political landscape where we didn't have to keep asking for just pieces of the pie. We were at a point where we needed to demand, like Brian said, the whole thing, all the policy that we dream of. Like, this is a political moment to do that. And so that's where Measure J was born out of. The language that was pulled to create Measure J came out of all the budget work that folks like CURB, Justice LA, La Defensa have been doing in LA County for years now, around really IDing, like, look, you're giving $2 million to the DA's office to prosecute parents because their kids can't get to school. Why don't you shift that money? And so that is what we have, detailed as a Care First budget, which is what we've been pushing to move dollars away. But so the polling of the language of Measure J builds off of that. And that's where it came from the grassroots, from community, from the folks who have been impacted, being at the table, getting to write the actual measured language. That's where it was born out of. And then it was presented to the Board of Supervisors. And we had a leader who really understood where we were trying to go with this. That was Supervisor Sheila Kuehl, who took the dive and saying, I'm going to author this. But that wasn't an easy process, right? Like, I wish they would have been like, yes, let's put millions of dollars in these things. But because they haven't, we had to put Measure J together and really push for these dollars. So that's where Measure J was born out of. I could talk a little bit of timeline real quick, if that's okay, because I think it's really important. A lot of these propositions have had, months in advance to plan, even over a year or years, right? With Measure J, literally our deadline to put this on the ballot, or that the Board of Supervisors had to vote it in, was August 4th. That was the last day. So that's the last day that they voted on it, and that's when we got it on the ballot. But that means our campaign, essentially, we started conversations in July, drafted that language and presented to the board so that they voted in August. And then from there, the ballots at homes, as you all know, started coming in the first week of October. So that was our campaign timeline, August 4th, essentially to the first week of October, and again to November 3rd. But we had to really figure out how to, door knocking, right? Like, that's traditional campaigns. Like, we had to really figure out how to do this campaign without being able to touch upon people's doors, knocking and talking with them. And I think that's something that I could talk about later if you like, but I think that was super critical to us, getting over 2 million LA County voters to support this measure, because we beat the police. That's the biggest thing I think that came out of this, is that we beat the over $3.5 million that they put against us, and the weeks of commercials that they bought. But yeah, it was an incredible campaign.
I'm gonna keep that one, beat the police. It's gonna stick into my brain. The common theme amongst all of y'all and hearing about what the amazing work you're doing, at least for me, what I'm hearing right now is, ensuring that, thinking that these have a timeline, thinking that these things may take more than a month and 5 months, whatever it may be, ensuring that infrastructure is there, that the ducks are in a row, that you're able to move quickly to take advantage of an opportunity to put up Prop 17 or take down 25 or to look for Measure J. And that to me is super important, having that flexibility and having that kind of organizational insight or sight to take advantage of those opportunities. But before you go, Eunisses, I know that you also, through Justice LA and through La Defensa, were involved in thinking about Prop 25. And there's a question that popped up in the chat, and I'll open it up to Brian, Taina as well, is thinking about that. Similar to the misattribution of J and to Measure J and Gascon to one individual, there's now this kind of weird misattribution happening between the bail industry and 25. Can you pull that apart for us and talk to us a little about 25 and clear up some of that confusion?
Sure. Thank you for that question. And I didn't speak about Gascon, and I should have, but everything that happened in LA County was something that folks have been working on for many years, right? Like BLM outside of Jackie Lacey's office weekly, every single Wednesday. I think that, and then Holly Mitchell also running, and her understanding of the budget and all of her advocacy work at the CJ level at the state. So all of these things happened. There was different groups working on it, but one of the things I think made us so successful in LA County this year was all the conversations happening on the back end with these different coalitions. So I do want to uplift that it was not a single organization, but more of like a melting pot of people willing to, work together at this moment, because we knew we couldn't let things slide by. If we wanted to live in LA County that we dream about, right? Like we're gonna have to make some relationships and build, and so that's what we did, and I think that's why we're successful in LA. But Prop 25, for folks that don't know, Justice LA stopped LA County's $3.5 billion jail plan. They wanted to build a women's jail, Lancaster, a mental health jail for people with behavioral health needs in downtown LA. And we have the largest pretrial population in the entire country with over 6,500 people there because of the way that the current pretrial system exists. Many of them cannot pay to get out. And there's a pilot, when SB 10 passed, in the beginning, community was heavily involved. Towards the end of that process, community was cut out of what SB 10 really turned into. And so it was a bill that was completely opposite of what folks had been advocating for in the beginning. What folks have to understand is that SB 10 would have expanded, and these are the issues that we had with it. And I'll explain where that group is coming from as well. But the biggest thing is that it would expand probation, because probation, at least what we've seen in LA County, probation would have been assigned to supervise people who have been released pre-trial, and they would also be running the risk assessment tools. The second issue is risk assessment tools. We are connected with experts from MIT, Harvard, folks putting together these tools, telling us that there is bias in these tools, that the biggest factor to determining someone's risk is how young someone is. The younger you are, the higher the risk. We also have seen how judges have been a roadblock to advancing almost all the advocacy work we're doing here in LA County. They're a barrier to pretrial reform, a barrier to getting people out during COVID-19, a barrier to advancing alternatives to incarceration. And so we understood giving judicial counsel and judges more power and discretion was not the way that we were going to liberate our folks, especially when judges are telling us that, yeah, no, I'm going to incarcerate someone for their first time for a DUI, even if it's their first time, I don't care, without, taking anything into consideration. So for us, those were the biggest factors of SB 10 that we were concerned with. And then the state gave 17 counties a total of over $75 million so that these counties could begin to do early SB 10 implementation. LA County was one of those recipient counties. And what we saw is LA County got over $17 million, and that most for this pilot, and most of it went to probation. And it also went to the judges. The judges were running it here in LA County. And just after a few months, because it started earlier this year during COVID in March, even though the judges were telling us this is going to help us release more people, we've seen that during this pilot, incarceration rates are higher, and that Black women in particular are the ones that are getting incarcerated pre-trial during this pilot than any other group and remanded. They're only 8% of our county population, but 75% of the people remanded during this pilot. And so when people are talking about Prop 25, it's not that we are talking because we are, well, what I've seen us compared to is leftist radicals in the media, but really it's this analysis is based on the things that are happening on the ground in LA County. We are so deeply connected with the bureaucracy. It's taken a long time, but we're getting data, we've gotten information, we know how probation works. So for us, the Committee to End Pretrial Racism was born out of that analysis because we knew we had to do something. Nobody got money from the bail industry. This is because we knew what the results were going to be of SB 10 in LA County because we were seeing it already. And then if it was going to happen here, it's going to happen way worse in Bakersfield, in Kern County, or Riverside, and San Bernardino, with even much more worse pretrial systems. So that's a lot to say. But there's a link that was just shared around No on Prop 25. This is a group of grassroots organizations, people directly impacted, like Essie Justice, and also Initiate Justice was supporting on the side, but not, there was folks who had to be careful on how to come out because it was a very strenuous campaign, if I could just say that. Like, it was hard. It was heavy on organizers. I feel like if I could just be candid, it fractured the CJ movement. And there's a lot of healing that has to happen, but it really comes with the things that we've seen happening on the ground with early implementation of SB 10. And there's a question about the plan. Well, that's great, because if I could just answer really quickly, and Brian, please feel free to plug in. We've been working for over a year to develop what's called PPI, Preserving the Presumption of Innocence. It's a pretrial policy platform from A to Z on what the pretrial system should look like, that is fair, that doesn't rely on risk assessments or money expanding judicial power. And so we're already having conversations with legislators about this, this measure. We're having conversations at the county level about them interested in starting a pilot, which also brings me to say that during the campaign, folks said that this would not be possible. We weren't going to be able to move pretrial reform. And here we are having these conversations. So yeah, it's Brian, please feel free to plug in. Taina, that was a very tumultuous, intense time.
The less we talk about SB 10, the better.
Yeah, I can't possibly add any more facts to those, to what you just spit in Eunisses. I think the only thing that I will say is, like, if you look at the whole picture, right? If you look at the decisive victory of Prop 17 and Measure J, and the way that Proposition 20 was defeated, and even the fact that Proposition 25 lost, I think that shows that the voters are are understanding very clearly what is happening. The voters are saying, you know, we need investment in community, we need to reject tough on crime policies, and we can't take these false solutions. People in the movement have been expressing concern about SB 10 from the very beginning. I remember, you know, when I was working on SB 10, like early on in the process, and when I started to see like where it was going, like initiate justice backed off, and then, you know, it was something that was driven through by the legislature, and now, as Eunisses said, the community is having to clean up the mess. Now, you know, y'all are the ones who are coming up with the solutions. I'm so grateful for your intelligence and your research, and, you know, all of the hard work that you've been doing, and to really like speak out with the courage that y'all had to express an unpopular opinion. Because, like, you know, was mentioned earlier, there is this misunderstanding, like, oh, are you aligning yourself with the bail industry? Are you gonna allow them to win? If this is defeated, then it means that we can't do anything around bail reform in the future. And I think that what the defeat of Prop 25 has showed us, like, absolutely not. We can do whatever we want. We can do it right. And we're going to come back and do it correctly the next time. So yeah, I'm just super, super grateful for Eunisses and Brian, and, you know, all of the folks at Justice LA who have, like, and Essie, who have been holding the line on bail. Thank y'all so much.
I just want to underline what Taina said, especially around Justice LA's bravery and leadership. Our coalition was one that had to remain neutral because we're consensus-based, and we had organizations that couldn't agree. And the reality is, as Taina said, being no on 25 was not popular. And I think that a big lesson to come out of this is watching folks co-opt community success. I just spent this morning speaking to new legislators, and one thing I really wanted to underline is that No on 25 was a community success. Like, we were tracking what was happening with the proposition before Justice LA got involved and the momentum that it had after. And anyone who is confused about the reason why Prop 25 failed really is out of touch with what was happening on the ground, because the reality is communities stopped Proposition 25 because in reality, we've been working on something better for 2 years in pretrial work groups. So people have a plan. Justice LA has a plan. Their coalition of folks working on PPI is growing every single day. And the powerful thing for all of us, I think, in this movement is really realizing that we can do anything. And that if we trust our mission and trust our values and refuse to compromise when people offer us crumbs, that we can move mountains. It might take a minute to move, but we have the power to do it.
Amazing. And it reminds me of, you know, some of that conversation we had last week, of that kind of not the dissonance, but like the conflict that we often see with either funder-led initiatives or movement-led initiatives, and what that looks like. I'm interested if you ever heard of organizations or had that experience of having that threat there. Well, if you're not working on SB 10, then we're going to pull funding. Or if you heard that, you know, there was more push on the dollar side of things, because I think that's interesting to pull apart to, again, really trust the community and what they're doing and their point of view. So I guess that, you know, I'll pose that to the three of you.
Eunisses, would you like
Yeah,
to take the lead here?
Okay, I'll get started. You know what? What I can say is that, Prop 25 was not only unpopular out in the community, in public to talk about, but it was also very unpopular in funder conversations. And it got very, I'm just going to use the word tumultuous again, not because a lot of folks were actually threatened with like, look, you can't come out in support of this, like you cannot endorse this because we're supporting this. And so we heard things from comments from people who are a part of our coalition, and that was very frightening to think about, that folks were actually saying these things on email threads, having these conversations about pulling funding from organizations because of these positions, without actually really listening to the analysis on why we were in opposition. So that was something which was a very intense experience. And if I could just bring up, like, funders have a responsibility, like you all are funding us, but also have a responsibility in what you're funding. And something that we've been sharing, especially in funder groups, is that, before you put in money, like ask yourself these questions, like, is the money that you're going to be putting in to help support policy that's going to leave people behind, dichotomize one group over another, making one deserving and one not? Are you giving more money to this to make policy that's going to give more money and more power to the systems we're trying to dismantle or shrink? And then are you going to give money to build something that will have to destroy in the future? Like, funders really have the responsibility to ask yourself questions when you're going to give dollars. And those are the three, at least, that we ask ourselves when moving policy. And if it's a yes to any of those questions, then we challenge ourselves to figure out what a different solution is. And that's the thing, like, it's hard work, it's more legwork, more time, but you build out stronger solutions based on more serious analysis than, just saying yes to whatever sounds sexy. And so, yeah, I think that it was a very intense experience, but also, I think funders have a lot to learn from this as well. Like, we can win with the right messaging, don't have to fold, we don't have to leave nobody behind, and we don't have to give more money and power to the system to win.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it's, I think, really important to talk about it and really sit on and think about that, that fact, listen to and trust and have that faith in organizers, in organizations, in leaders in this field, and thinking about, the people closest to the problem having the solutions. I'm going to move to, there's a couple of questions here that for all three of you. And again, if questions come up in the chat, feel free for the panel, for the attendees, just to pop them there, and we can follow up with questions. But the first one here is talking about and thinking about implementation and accountability. So, and it's kind of multifaceted, right? And it depends on the organization, depends on the person. So these issues are across the finish line, but what happens now? How are we going to ensure that these plans and policies are followed? And how can and if they will, how can organizations pivot from advocacy and organizing to implementation work, if appropriate? So I was wondering if I can open up that to the three of you, if to answer some of those questions.
Sure, I'm happy to start with Prop 17 because it seems like this is probably the simplest. Like, we're very fortunate to be working with organizations who are in direct communication with, like, the Secretary of State's office, and we're in direct contact with CDCR. So we're able to ensure that, statewide websites and everything are updated so that folks know that their rights to vote are restored immediately upon release from prison. But it is up to the community to ensure that people know that they can register and understand, why their vote is meaningful. And I think that we can point to examples like Measure J and like the defeat of Prop 20 and like the election of DA Gascónand and say, look, this is why our voices are important, and this is why we need to ensure that we see things all the way through. The campaign never ends. I think sometimes, it's all just like one big cycle, right? Like, we win one thing, but we need to keep up the movement so that we can win the next thing. We need to make sure the things that we have envisioned like actually come to fruition. We have watched so many policies pass and then, nothing happens afterwards. So this is, just like the ongoing struggle. So I would definitely encourage funders to stay involved in the work, like, especially after it's over. I think the best example of that I can share is Prop 57 in 2016. There was so much effort put behind getting Proposition 57 passed. And then the day after the election, Initiate Justice started getting thousands of letters pouring in from people inside saying, okay, well, how does this impact me? When do I get out? How am I going to be resentenced? What is the process looking like? And then, after it passed, like not a lot of people were talking about those things. So we had to follow it all the way through the regulations process. We are still working on bills that have to do with implementing different parts of Prop 17, and it's more than 4 years later. So yeah, I think that's just a reminder to everybody that these campaigns never really end. Nothing ends until the work is done.
Thank you for that, Taina. It's so important. And I really love this question as well, because implementation is so important and often overlooked. Alongside budgets being sexy, I guess my hope for 2021 is that implementation becomes sexy. And I think Measure J is going to be a really great example of that. Taina said, our victories sometimes are challenging because it takes so long for us to actually win. And I mean, I always say our victories have quotes around them, because even when we win, we always have to keep fighting. And I think in terms of implementation, in the Yes on J coalition, we've built a policy advocacy committee who are relentlessly meeting up and thinking about ways where we can make the realities that we imagine true for everyone. And I think really seeing the process that played out through the Alternatives to Incarceration initiative in LA County is really going to inform how implementation works for Measure J. We know that we have to be ready when system actors at the county level start to form these committees with their recommendations that aren't necessarily going to align with our values. And we have created spaces to strategize and push back against anything that's not within the spirit of Measure J and what we want to bring to our marginalized communities. I'd love to hear from Eunisses more about this.
Thank you, Brian. And yes, just to reiterate how important implementation is, and I'm going to tie it to something that Brian said earlier around the system trying to regenerate itself. The system is always going to try to save itself. It's always going to try to keep its dollars, its staffing positions, everything that it has. And so in implementation, that's where you see that regeneration trying to happen through bills that'll roll things back, through community getting cut out of the process. And with Measure J, we incorporated some of that because we've learned some lessons on our way to this point, where we want to make sure that community could, especially people directly impacted, could be a part of how those dollars are prioritized, where they're distributed to. And so in Measure J, we included a line that says that there has to be an inclusive and transparent implementation process. Nowhere in the LA and nowhere else in the LA County budget does community have access to or a say where they go, even if it's, a part of the $8.8 billion that LA County generates locally with locally generated tax dollars. So even then, Measure J is really the only bucket where they have a say. And so now, we didn't have to wait till next year to start implementation. Like implementation started the week right after, and we were working on implementation language before Measure J passed, because I don't want to sound like cocky, but we were confident that we were going to win because of the landscape we were in, the hunger that people had, the pain. And so we started planning implementation before that. And so as soon as Measure J passed, right before it passed, there was a motion by the Board of Supervisors that developed a working group. But we had to do this because if not, the county itself, there's certain departments that are not law enforcement related, that are more like the lawyers, like county council, or like the people who run the dollars, like the chief executive office. And sometimes the barriers or the regeneration happens through them instead of the traditional system of injustice. And so we had to make sure, and we saw that during the campaign where they were like, no, it's not $500 to $1 billion. It's only $300 million that you're looking at. But our analysis showed that, the Measure J dollars that we should expect to get from this bucket of 8.8 billion is 500 to $1 million. And I think that's the most important thing during implementation, that we'll have to make sure that these other county departments don't try to finesse us for the full amount of money that we fought for and that we know is located in this bucket of money. But like Brian said, implementation is sexy and we must continue to invest in this process. it's tough. People need to be able to bring on folks to follow these policies through, be able to support, the process of getting people relief. And yeah, I just would reiterate how important it is to invest in this particular process and particular phase of implementation.
All right, cool. Thank you to all three of you. And in thinking about that and kind of unpacking what that looks like, it kind of leads me to my next question. And after this question, we'll again open it up to those in the chat in case anything's on your mind. But what's next? What is next for you all? What are you thinking about? What's top of mind? Is it continuing an implementation piece? Is it continuing accountability, or is it a new campaign? And yeah, tell us a little bit about what's up.
I mean, I'm listening to Brian and Eunisses, and I'm feeling like the sky is the limit. I'm feeling like, look at what we have done so far. And I feel so confident with like really authentic leaders like y'all and the support of the people that we can literally do anything. But the campaign that I will personally say I'm the most excited to start working on now, and this is something I'm also partnering with Eunisses on, is we're part of the Repeal of Three Strikes Coalition. So we are aiming to get an initiative on the ballot in 2022 and do away with the California Three Strikes law once and for all. And this is a coalition that was that's created by Earlonne Woods, who is the founder of Ear Hustle, Zykia Prince, whose loved one is in prison serving time for three strikes, and several other like formerly incarcerated folks who served time on three strikes. And I think this is just going to be another example where in 2 years we're going to be having the conversation and saying like, look at what we did. We repealed three strikes, directly impacted people, led this from the ground up. Like, the time is right. We got a district attorney in the largest county, in the largest state in the country that incarcerates the most people, saying that we need to get rid of California's three strikes law. So that's what's next. That's, for me, that's the next pillar that's going to fall.
That's so fucking great, if you'll excuse my language. And just knowing that Eunisses and Taina are in leadership roles in that space brings warmth and confidence to my heart. And Curb is already looking
and
into—
Amber Rose from Curb.
I'm not supposed to say that because it's not official yet, but yes. Yes, so we're very excited to be working on Three Strikes Coalition. Amber Rose is our executive director. And yeah, like the power in that space is going to be incredible. And I also just want to uplift how much femme leadership is in criminal legal reform right now, especially in Southern California. Like, it's really astounding, and the women are holding so much. And I just, it's just incredible to be in a position to be inspired and led by such like incredible human beings. For Curb this year, if we have the right champion, we're going to be partnering with advocacy groups working to end felony murder special circumstances, sections B, C, and D, and other forms of extreme sentencing. I'm also on the executive team of Justice LA, who led the No on 20 campaign that Eunisses was just talking about. And Curb is actively looking for ways we can support the work that's going to be focused on pretrial reform, preserving the presumption of innocence, or the PPI framework. As we move ahead into 2021, we'll be very excited to share more information about the priorities for a budget to save lives, which is a 200 organization coalition with which Eunisses is a part of, and Taina through Curb is a part of, which details the community's fiscal priorities for a care first California. And central to Curb's piece of the project will be focused on developing a holistic reentry service for transgender and gender nonconforming people across the state. And most folks know Curb has been leading the work to close California prisons for more than a decade. The governor announced just this past year that he is open to closing 2 prisons by 2023. His own legislative analyst office, the state's own, suggested that potentially we could close 5 and release 20,000 people to the tune of saving about $400 million a year, rising exponentially. We're wondering why stop at 5. So Curb will be releasing a report in January calling for the closure of 10 California state prisons over the next 3 years.
Dang, that's so amazing. So much amazing work happening. I hope y'all get to take some time off during the holidays. There's for us and for I think for me and for the Justice LA Coalition, the biggest thing is PPI, like Brian mentioned. If we can reduce the LA County jail population by about 4,500 people, we can close down Men's Central Jail. And for us, closing down Men's Central Jail is a priority. It's a dungeon there. People are dying. And also to stop the incarceration of women in LA County. In a county of 10 million people, we only have about 1,500 women in the women's jail. We also have a transgender, gender nonconforming LGBTQ plus K6G unit in another jail. And so for us, a goal is to stop the incarceration, especially because most of them are there pre-trial because they can't pay to get out. We have hundreds of thousands of dollars in bail. And so we're working to get them out in partnership with folks like that are in their new positions, such as GeorgeGascónand, Holly Mitchell. And for us, it's like, how do we coalesce all these different folks in power to decarcerate, to close down jails, not to build new ones? And to help other jurisdictions follow this model or learn from our model. Something that we've been able to really finesse, I think, is the inside out strategy that we hope to teach other folks about. After Measure J passed, people from across the country started emailing us and calling us and saying, how did you do that? How did you figure that out? Help us with that. So that's also a big point for us. Like, how do we continue to move dollars, not only LA County and the state with, a budget to save lives, a Care First budget, but how do we help other people do that? And then last thing is that locally, there are still hundreds of millions of dollars that are going to the traditional system of injustice that we're going to fight to move so that we can, get our people free here and to stop their over incarceration in LA County, particularly in our homes. So that's what we're looking forward to. And with people like Taina and Brian, Amber Rose, like, we're going to get it. And we're asking for the whole pie. We're not compromising. We don't need to compromise. As long as people who have been most directly impacted are at the table to lead and to help with the analysis, to not just be, microphones for the process, but really take into consideration what they've gone through, I think is also critical. And it's something that we've done at JLA where our leaders are the most directly impacted. They make the decisions. But yeah, a lot to do.
And I'm smiling ear to ear, thinking about that, thinking about what happened in 2020. Really excited for the next couple of years and watching what happens, because it's inspiring. I mean, it's kind of gives me the chills. This next question is coming in from Maisha, and she's wondering about there's a big misconception, and I'll just read it here, amongst national CJ funders that California, you're already well established and you're well funded. I was wondering if y'all could talk about why this is wrong, and in which ways each of your organizations and broader coalitions still need support, and how California-based funders can continue to help amplify this. Can you talk a little bit about that? And she said she loves you all, by the way. I can't say the middle part because my boss is probably on the line, but she says you're awesome.
Taina, did you want to start, or should I just rip? I just want to name that the work of grassroots organizers is often invisible and underfunded. Just really quickly, CURB does 10,000 different things. We organize our coalition members into work groups that fight against incarceration and for healthy communities. We hold budget advocacy workshops that educate and empower people to demand that their representatives curb prison spending and expand the social safety net. We advance legislative policy change using direct action, targeted campaigns, and raw people power. CURB has never had more than 2 staff members up until last year. So I was hired on part-time in 2019, and that was like a big deal for CURB. Our annual budget was under $200,000 just 2 years ago. So we've grown incredibly over the past year because of the consistent support of our funders and the acknowledgement of our work by new people who are coming to the table. And I just want to say thank you for people who did this for us or to other organizations. So many funders suspended reporting for 2020, and and we're happy to sit in on our workshops or talk to us on the phone to hear about our work. And so many people made additional contributions to our work, knowing how difficult 2020 would be. And as we grow, we need that support to increase our capacity. We only have, 2 hands, and hands, minds, bodies, hearts. That's what makes this work happen. And in order to do that, we need to hire people. And in order to hire people, we need consistent multi-year funding.
To those folks who say that California is already well-funded, I really want to know what they mean by well-funded. California still has the death penalty. California still has LWOP. California still has 3 strikes. We still have extreme sentencing. We have the highest prison and jail population in the country. So clearly we still have plenty of work to do. And it's not for a lack of skilled, strategic, and hardworking impacted people. The folks are here, the funding and the resources are not necessarily what we need to get where we need to go, especially considering that so many of these laws have been put into place by a ballot proposition, meaning that we're going to need another ballot proposition to do anything to affect, especially like LWOP or the 3 strikes law. We need millions and millions of dollars to move every year. So it might be true that we have enough funding here and there to, get through and win a couple of campaigns each year to address some low-hanging fruit. But while these extreme, policy injustices are still in place, we need more money. We need more resources to be able to move the big changes. And I just cannot get over, Eunisses called me in July to say, hey, we're trying to get this proposition on the ballot in November. It needs to pass the Board of Supervisors in 2 weeks. I was like, how are they going to do this? And it was just the power of the people, and the cops came out against it with all the funding and all of the resources. So look at what folks are able to do just with grassroots support and with the small amount of funding that we're getting right now. So for those folks who are saying California is already good, say imagine if y'all would let California be great.
100%. Just to add that we still have Measure J campaign debt. Anybody who is welcome to support that effort. Thank you. But yes, no, I think that question that Taina poses is one that funders should ask themselves, because yes, we're doing the work, but the work looks like 18-hour days. It looks like having to rely on tons of volunteers without people getting paid in a time where evictions are on the rise and there's a wave coming and people are struggling, but we have had more volunteers at any moment in time, but we can't pay people. And that's the thing, a lot of folks who are leading these organizations, like Brian mentioned, it's been 1 or 2 people working at the helm of this, and that's what we're seeing on the ground. It's a lot of small organizations really doing a lot of the legwork, connecting with the people. But it's not easy, and it's what we saw this year at least was not only was COVID impactful, but also other health ailments and even mental health. A lot of folks who have been impacted, I've never been incarcerated, but I'm a survivor of different types of violence, and oftentimes to preserve the recommendations or the policy, we'll have to continuously tell our stories to try to preserve that. And that's not easy to do. And even in funder spaces, having to share that is not easy to do. So I would hope folks know that it's not just about showing up. The advocacy is not just about showing up to the Board of Supervisors, having hundreds of people show up, but it's all the legwork behind it, the countless hours. The fact is that we need more hands on deck, especially with implementation. I don't think there's enough. I don't think any organization on this call says they can say they have enough staff to feel fully comfortable, so that Taina can take some time off, so I can pull away to recharge. So Brian, has that support. You ask them. We don't have that. We're doing the work, but it really is going to require folks to be okay with giving general operating funds so we can hire people to do different types of work. There is a lot of need still, and like Taina mentioned, we're not perfect. There's so much still to do. There's even still I don't like when people say low hanging fruit, oh, we got low hanging. No, it's we have to go beyond that if we're really going to achieve true liberation. And folks need to understand that that's the kind of funding it's going to take. We just need more people to get paid to thrive in this work. If not, we cannot continue just to survive generation after generation.
And if I could actually I'm sorry, Brian. I just wanted to add something to that really quickly, and not only like hire more people, but like live our values and treat people well. Like we want to pay people like a really good
But I was about to
salary.
say, Taina, as
Oh,
usual,
well,
you are
then
reading my
take it
mind.
away, Brian. Take it away. You know, like I'm learning a lot as an ED about HR. It's expensive to give people the vacation and the benefits and everything, but this is what our folks deserve. This is like 1,000% what our folks deserve. So it's not only about like hiring people, it's about giving them like everything that they need to thrive. And also, you know, there's extra work that goes into training folks who are directly impacted, because the system doesn't invest in us to be like policy leaders. You know, the system puts us on a track to, you know, work in trades and things like that. So for those of us who are coming into this movement and didn't necessarily receive an elite education, it's incumbent upon the nonprofits to give folks like the training and the, you know, the development that they need. And all of that costs money. All of that costs money.
Taina, as usual, reading my mind, and exactly all of those things. And I just wanted to say that, you know, speaking about staff and staffing levels, in 2018, CURB, who had 2 statewide coordinators, my memory is that, I'm just going to say this bluntly, my memory is that they were both making $45,000 a year, and they both live in LA County or LA adjacent. Like, that's not a livable wage. And to get to $60,000 a year, there had to be like a coordinating committee meeting and like advisory board meeting. And, you know, that's all important because that accountability is important, but people need to be paid a living wage. This work is not easy. And I'm so happy Adrienne talked about a healing justice framework as well. One of our funders, and I'm not sure if I can out them, but they're incredible and they're fantastic, specifically granted CURB 2 healing justice grants so that I could pay for my physical therapy for my bum hip, so I could join a gym, so I could actually have the energy to be able to do this work. So the idea that supporting Black people, supporting brown people, supporting women, supporting queer people and trans people has to do with funding their ability to live, and live means more than just paying rent, right? Like, we have to be in a space where we can process all the trauma that we're constantly receiving all of the time and have the emotional space in order to sustain this work for the long haul, because burnout is real.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And, you know, as again, another quote, thinking about Ashley Henderson from the Highlander Center, fund us like you want to win, you know, fund us or fund organizations, and thinking about not just the wins that they're pushing across, but everything that went into that work. I think that that is really super important, and thinking about that burnout is real. Burnout is so real, and it's going to turn into retraining, rehiring, initiating that engine to continue to push. So why not just make the investments now? I really appreciate that. You know, thank you for bringing that up, because we got to hear it over and over and over again to really push it into people's minds. I know we only have about 2 minutes left. First and foremost, thank the 3 of you. I think it's, for me, every time I talk to you, every time I see you, I learn something more, and I keep stacking it in my mind, taking more notes, and I really appreciate it. I wanted to give, if you have any closing thoughts or anything that you wanted to say in the last 2 minutes, feel free to say something, or if there's any questions that any burning questions anybody wants to ask, to pop it there in the chat. But yeah, Adrienne, I think we're good. Or I guess the final logistics for this is, yes, everything's going to be recorded and sent out, and follow up. You got 3 really great people on the call right now, so send them an email, give them a call. Eunisses, I see you put yourself off mute there. Oh, and take a survey, which is in the link in the chat box.
Just wanted to add the last piece that I feel like folks need to remember is that don't get comfortable. You know, we have a new administration in LA County. We have new leadership, new faces, friendly faces, but we cannot get comfortable, right? We saw that during the time where we had people who were friendly, we weren't able to accomplish as much as we've been able to accomplish, because things had different lenses. And so that's what I would just hope that everybody, can take with them into 2021. Do not get comfortable, even if the leadership is friendly. Like, we have to keep fighting for as much as possible, because they will finesse us. That's what we've seen over and over and over again. So just be on the lookout and do not get comfortable.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I want to both thank, I know that there's funders who are watching right now who are already like living out these values and being like super supportive. So, thanks to y'all. And, for folks, if you're not already funding in these spaces, or, maybe you feel like you have the ability to give some more, like, please go ahead and do that. Like, where, folks like Eunisses and Brian, like, we've got a demonstrated track record of success. We are, working in community with folks who have the lived experiences and are the experts of our experiences. So please continue to trust us and support this work. We're all dedicated to this, like, because our lives depend on it, and we will do this for as long as we are able to.
Thanks so much for that, Taina. And thank you to Roger and Adrienne and Crystal and everyone at CCJFG and everyone for coming out and listening to us today talk about this work, which is, the most important moral issue of our time and requires everybody's attention.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of this Monday afternoon, evening, whatever it may be, wherever time zone you're coming in from. And that's it. Have a good one. And again, we'll send out the recording, and please fill out the survey that Adrienne put up in the chat.
Thank you, everyone.